Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Rebecca Lammers. I am the chair of the Democrats Abroad Taxation Task Force. It's my pleasure to be presenting to you today how to help pass residency-based taxation. Before we get started, I'm just going to ask everybody who's attending to please fill in the feedback form. Your feedback is really essential in order to help us improve on these webinars that we're presenting. So after the webinar, please take this link and fill in your feedback in order to help us improve on webinars in the future. And also, before we get started, I'm just going to quickly read this disclaimer. Democrats abroad cannot provide individual tax advice. Advice requires consideration of your individual circumstances and needs, none of which can be done at this event. We are not tax lawyers, accountants, or advisors. Please consult a professional tax advisor, accountant, return preparer when addressing your personal tax matters. Democrats Abroad does not endorse or recommend companies or individuals attending or hosting this event. The views expressed at the event are those of the respective individuals and companies, not Democrats Abroad. No liability is accepted by Democrats Abroad for the opinions expressed or for any errors or omissions expressed about matters of tax in any country, your financial planning, or your legal obligations. If you are in need of tax advice, you can consult the IRS Tax Return Preparer Directory to find an advisor or tax return preparer near you or providing online services to meet your needs and budget, though buyers need always beware. Okay, great. Now that we have that out of the way, we've now finished with introductions and housekeeping. I'm then going to go into the main presentation. I'll then take a few minutes to tell you a little bit more about Democrats Abroad, and then we will finish it out with the Q&A session. So before we get into this, just to kind of set the context for everybody here, we have been hosting a tax webinar series every Wednesday throughout the year so far. Basically, this is the grand finale. This is our final tax webinar for the tax series. And if you missed any of our previous tax webinars, they're all different topics ranging from basic consumer advice on how to find an accountant, all the way up to how to file your own FBAR or file your own taxes even. So these tax education webinars are really a key part of our work that we do within the taxation task force. Education is really important for people to better understand not only how difficult filing taxes are for Americans abroad, but also in terms of better understanding the problems that Americans abroad face from an advocacy perspective. So we get lots of emails from people saying that they found our tax education webinars to be very helpful. And so if you are interested in any of these topics, you're more than welcome to go back and watch the recording for a small donation, some of which are free, including this webinar. Also, we host a range of country-specific tax webinars in order to dig into those cross-border issues, as well as like country-specific products or pension or savings accounts and things like that. So on the screen here, we have a number of tax education webinars coming up around the world. If you see one that is for your country, please do sign up and join us so that you can find out more. Okay, great. So again, my name is Rebecca Lammers. I am the chair of the Democrats Abroad Taxation Task Force. I have been a member of Democrats Abroad since I moved abroad 17 years ago, but it wasn't until after Trump got elected that I was like, I don't know what's going on here. So in 2017, I got more involved and I started volunteering for the Democrats Abroad Taxation Task Force, which I'll tell you a little bit more about our group here in a minute. I took over as chair over 2 years ago, and since then we have been looking at expanding the group. So it was originally about a dozen people that were part of the taxation task force, and I grew it to, we now have over 80 members who are volunteering and helping. Additionally, I am the international member of the Taxpayer Advocacy panel, which I will talk about in more detail later on. But I just wanted to start out by clarifying that I am not an accountant. I am not a tax professional. I am just like you. Basically, I moved abroad and I did file my taxes. I used TurboTax for a number of years, and then I realized that I had been doing it wrong. And then I called a bunch of accountants and trying to figure out what I was supposed to do. And I called 6 different accountants and I got 6 different answers. And I found it incredibly frustrating. And um, so I'm passionate about reforming taxes for Americans abroad on a personal level because of what I have faced on a personal level, but also because these are systemic issues. And I think a lot of people attending this webinar may feel very hopeless, but I have seen through my activism and also through the things that people in the taxation task force that are volunteering have accomplished that it is possible for change to happen. And I'm very inspired by all of the work that you guys have been doing, which fuels my activism in turn and makes me feel very positive for the future. So just to clarify, I'm not an accountant. I can't answer tax questions, but what I am doing is I am advocating for change for Americans abroad through activism, basically. So I just wanted to clarify that up front. So to tell you a little bit more about the taxation task force, basically what we advocate for within Democrats abroad is a switch to residency-based taxation. Currently, the way it works is the United States has what's called a citizenship-based tax system. So American citizens, regardless of location in the world, are liable for filing and paying tax to the IRS. And what Democrats Abroad advocates for is a switch to residency-based taxation, which would mean that you would be taxed based on where you live only, unless, of course, you have US sourced income, in which case you would still be liable for paying tax on that. So it's a principle that is used by majority of other countries around the world, and which causes a lot of friction and the problems and difficulties that Americans abroad face in order with the tax code, basically. We also advocate for relief from FATCA for Americans abroad and exempting American business owners living abroad from the GILTI and the transition taxes. There's a whole list of other kinds of things that we advocate for as well, but you can read more about our work on our blog and the tax part of the Democrats Abroad website. So what do we do for you in our group? Well, one of them is we wrote the Tax and Financial Access Report on Americans Abroad, which came out over a year ago. And we conducted here, I'll go to that slide. So we basically conducted a survey of nearly 7,000 Americans abroad, asking them about their tax and financial access issues. And then we wrote this report to summarize the information that we collected from from the survey. I would really strongly recommend that you read this report if you haven't read it. The majority of people that I have spoken to that have said that they've read it, they said that they felt a lot less alone in their tax problems, and they realized that the issues they're experiencing are not individual, but are systemic. So it's large groups of people, Americans abroad in general, who experience a lot of these issues. So that is always a first port of call. I would really recommend that you start there if you're just beginning trying to better understand the tax issues that Americans abroad experience. So in addition to doing research and producing reports, we also help by hosting tax and financial education events all over the world, which I just mentioned. We also submit statements for the record to congressional hearings. We have another one, which I'm going to publish later today, with the House Financial Services Committee hearing with the FinCEN director from the other week. We also do candidate outreach and education, as well as visits to Washington, D.C. to talk to Congress, IRS, and Treasury. So we're doing a lot of different things in order to help Americans abroad on our the tax problems. So just to kind of take a step back here, what is the problem? So the problem is that Americans abroad are subject to US taxation on their worldwide income, regardless of wherever they live in the outside of the US. We are also subject to filing a US tax return annually, even though there's no tax due. One of the biggest bugbears that I have, and I'm sure a lot of you also have, is you probably are asking, why do I have to file a tax return to the IRS every year even though I owe no US tax? And it is a very good question. And it's a question that I've actually put to multiple congressional offices. It's a standard question I've started asking congressional offices. Do you have any idea why people have to file when they owe no US tax? And nobody has been able to give me a straightforward answer on that, to be honest. Um, it is a huge burden because it costs a lot of people to file a tax return because it's so complicated. And when people can't figure out how to do it themselves, they have to pay somebody else to do it. And it makes no sense that people have to pay somebody else to file a tax return that yields no revenue for the IRS. It makes no sense for the taxpayer to have to file to pay somebody to do it. The only ones benefiting in this cycle are those who work in the tax prep industry. Um, and so, and actually, if you look at the IRS statistics from the 2020 tax filing year, if you drill down and you look at the filings from abroad, 60% of people who filed from abroad owed no US tax. So that's processing of returns and paperwork at the IRS where they're making no money from it. It makes no sense for them to be spending money on processing $0 returns, just from like a normal perspective. So this is a good question. We also face restrictions from financial products in our country of residence. So for example, from savings products, investments, or pensions. Um, I don't plan on going into too much detail about FATCA today. I'm sure we'll talk about it one way or the other. But one of the things that's really clear from recent conversations that we've had with financial industry, investing organizations is that there's a lot of people that think FATCA is the reason that they're being restricted from investing or pensions or savings products in their country of residence, but it's not always FATCA that is the reason for that. So there are a whole like raft of different other issues and problems. I'll probably do another webinar on FATCA in particular at another time, but I just wanted to make that point is that it's not just FATCA that is the problem. And also maintaining US tax compliance is complicated and expensive. So as I talked about, like people are filing and paying an accountant to file and they're not actually owing any US tax. It's a very unfair and complicated, and it shouldn't have to be that way. So why is it the way that it is? So I mentioned earlier about the US uses a citizenship-based tax system versus the rest of the world that uses a residency-based tax system. It's very difficult because you're having to comply with two different tax systems and they're not compatible. They don't fit together. So when that happens, then of course it's not going to be possible to be able to function properly in terms of conducting your normal financial life. So it makes it difficult on that front. You also need to keep in mind that the US tax code is a patchwork quilt of different tax provisions that have been passed by Congress every year. They're constantly tweaking and going in and changing a little thing here and there, and they're just building and building on top of it every single year. That's not a functioning tax code, and it's not serving its purpose either in terms of the government collecting revenue in order for it to function and pay for itself. It's a broken system basically. And the other problem is that Congress doesn't think of us when drafting legislation, which has caused unintended consequences. Um, we are often out of sight, out of mind. They don't hear from us, so they don't know that there are problems. We're also not getting support from any of the federal agencies. So the IRS makes it very difficult for Americans abroad to file a tax return in the first place. It's almost like they don't want us to file a tax return when we're supposed to. They make it very unfriendly in terms of being able to enter a non-US address, a non-US phone number. It's just like it was not built with us in mind. And then the same thing with the US State Department, which is responsible for embassies and consulates all over the world. There's no support with filing a tax return from the embassies and consulates. So it is completely a broken system. And on top of that, it's a corrupt system, as I'm sure a lot of you hear in the news about different types of problems going on with either members of Congress or different problems and issues with the federal agencies and things like that. So that's kind of like the why. I just, again, wanted to kind of provide some more context here in terms of what is residency-based taxation. And I think there, for people that are familiar with this term, there is an ongoing conversation about like people who are wanting what's referred to as pure RBT, where it's literally just where people are taxed based on where they live, and that is that. And it's although a concept that most countries use, every country has its own definition of what RBT is, more or less. Some of them have different rules in terms of how long you're deemed a resident based on how long you've lived in the country or lived outside of the country. People are taxed differently depending on the source of income as well. And so every country is different. Every country has a different definition of RBT. And that is also, I think, a problem in terms of when people are having conversations about trying to better understand what RBT is. Everybody has a different definition of what it is in their head. And nobody has actually written down and said, okay, this is what RBT is in a very detailed kind of way. And until you actually have a bill that specifically itemizes what it is, then it's a concept. It's not clearly defined. So I think a lot of people talk about RBT, but two different people could be talking about RBT and meaning slightly different things. And this is a difficulty that we face in terms of defining what it is, in terms of putting forward an ask to Congress to pass residency-based taxation. So yeah, multiple different levels of problems that we face in terms of passing residency-based taxation. The number one thing really is you need a bill. You need to start with a bill. That's one step of many steps that are involved with passing residency-based taxation or changing the system to a residency-based tax system. There is a severe lack of congressional awareness. Again, just to reiterate here that only US Congress, which is the House of Representatives, and the Senate has the power to change the laws. I know people are going to say, oh, well, the president can too. If you look at the way that Congress is passing laws and how the president is then signing off on them, you know, at the end of the day, the president has the right to veto any law that's passed by Congress. However, it's very rare and has not happened in this particular congressional session. So the president is pretty much going to sign whatever bill Congress passes. So really the ones that we're focused on in terms of awareness and actually are the ones that have the power to change the laws are the House of Representatives and the Senate. So US Congress, them, that's it, nobody else. Very simple. A lot of congressional offices that we've talked to aren't even aware that the US has a citizenship-based tax system. They aren't aware that other countries have a residency-based tax system. They just know how the US system works. They don't know how other countries' systems work. So they don't know that there's an incompatibility issue. So how are they to change the laws that they don't know exist or are aware are broken if it's not brought to their attention in the first place? The other thing is that we're competing for airtime. So there aren't enough Americans abroad contacting their members of Congress about these issues. There's an estimated 9 million Americans living outside of the US, and there are not 9 million contacting their members of Congress. That's for sure. Congress hears from hundreds, if not thousands, of their constituents, whether that be in their district or in their state, every day on a range of issues. You have to understand that we're essentially competing for airtime with these offices. And also some coalitions have hundreds of organizations working together on one particular issue. So for example, like on abortion rights or gun reform, while compared to what we're trying to do with our tax advocacy work, there are only a handful of American abroad organizations that even exist in the first place. I can count on one hand how many there are. That's not enough people working on this issue. Third problem is that there is a disconnect between Congress and Americans abroad. Elected representatives listen when votes are on the line. So this being a critical election year, this is a great time to start to engage with people that are going to be on your ballot leading up to voting on issues that you want them to care about, like reforming the tax code for Americans abroad. Other issue is that not enough Americans abroad actually vote. Less than 10% of Americans abroad vote from abroad. And unfortunately, a lot of members of Congress listen to their voters and not necessarily those who are deemed constituents. And just to clarify, you are a constituent of the last place that you resided in the US. And if you never resided in the US, then it's based on where your American parent last lived. So you vote where you last lived, but you are also a constituent based on the state or district of where you last lived. So you are a constituent, whether you realize it or not, of at least you have one House of Representative and you have two state senators. And those are the people that are supposed to represent you. That is how the system works. And not enough Americans abroad write or call their members of Congress. Out of the huge volume of all of these calls and letters and emails that they get, they're just not hearing enough from us. And I know this because we've gone into congressional offices, and one of the first questions that we ask is, how many constituents abroad have you heard from on the tax problems for Americans abroad? And I mean, we've been in meetings where they've literally heard nothing from any constituent abroad. So it is really important to keep in mind that we need to inform Congress on these issues, because if they don't hear from us, then they don't know that these problems exist. And finally, the fourth problem, we're out of sight, out of mind. We face a huge number of stereotypes. In particular, the biggest stereotype is that, if they even think about Americans living abroad, they have this misperception that we're all rich and left the country to evade taxes. There's even this perception that we abandoned the United States and that we're unpatriotic, which is obviously not the case. And for those who are aware of the issues, they take a view that if we don't like the way things are, then we can just renounce. But obviously, you need to have a second citizenship in order to renounce. And people don't want to renounce because they view themselves as being an American citizen, and they shouldn't have to renounce because maintaining and keeping your citizenship should be your right to do that. You should not be having to face renunciation based out of fear or based out of the government's incompetence, which is basically what is driving the renunciation numbers up. You should have a right to keep your citizenship. And lastly, they don't realize that we are constituents. So we actually have to go through an education piece with congressional staff sometimes who don't even realize that they have constituents abroad. So, oh, sorry, another problem. So Congress has reached levels of dysfunction not seen ever. I mean, this year is a particularly challenging year. It's a presidential election year, which tends to eat up a lot of the oxygen in DC. Just to give you some more context, Congress passed only 27 bills last year, making it a historically unproductive Congress. And compared to 2021, when Democrats held the House by a same slim majority that the Republicans have right now, Congress passed 85 bills. So, I mean, 3 times as many. Oh, that's better. And then also for some more context, in the 80th Congress, which was famously dubbed the Do-Nothing Congress, they passed over 900 bills. So, I mean, we've just reached like new levels of dysfunction. So it's very difficult. We face a lot of challenges. So the other thing I wanted to give some context is what is advocacy? Because I think a lot of people think that we do lobbying, and lobbying or lobbyists have money. We don't have money. Advocates do not have money. And what we do is we use our experience and knowledge to impress on Congress the urgency and the need in order to reform the tax laws. So that's the difference between advocacy and lobbying. So that is what we are doing. We are doing advocacy. And what we are doing is also no different from any other advocacy or issue-based group. Pick whatever issue, right? Gun reform or whatever the different kinds of issues that people are lobbying Congress or advocating for to Congress. What we are doing is no different. And lots of groups do this every day. We're not starting from scratch. We don't need to reinvent the wheel on this. We just need to use the advocacy tools that exist. So some other additional kinds of things that I wanted to share with you in terms of congressional feedback. In general, we have been able to build good credibility in DC about being expert knowledge. We have expert knowledge on this particular issue. And some of the feedback that we've received is that different congressional offices are visited by different American abroad groups, and we're all advocating for different things. So when all the different American abroad groups are advocating for different things, Congress doesn't know what we want, so they don't do anything. So they're getting mixed messaging. Also, we've gotten feedback that some of the offices can't even tell the difference between one American abroad group versus the other, which is definitely fixable and is unfortunate. But I think there's a way of getting over that, which is making us more well known. Asking for RBT, going into an office and asking for RBT when a congressional staffer has never heard of it before and doesn't even know that the US has a CBT system. It's like going from 0 to 100 without establishing a relationship in the first place. It's a very hard ask. And it's very difficult. And even Republican offices that we've talked to about residency-based taxation have said that this is not something that they would support. So we have a lot of barriers. The main thing is education to get through. We also have the perception problem about, Democrats aren't comfortable changing the tax laws due to being perceived as loosening tax evasion or money laundering laws for overseas. There's a huge misperception that there are lots of people moving overseas in order to evade taxes, and really in reality, a majority of the tax evasion is happening from people who live in the United States, who are using accounts outside of the US in order to evade taxes. So one of the points that we tend to make is go after the actual tax cheats who live in the US and stop using us as a scapegoat. Another issue is that Republicans aren't nearly as familiar with American abroad issues as Democrats are. We as Democrats abroad, with the name Democrats abroad, tend to have an easier time getting into congressional offices because we are also Democrats. It's a little harder getting into Republican offices with the name like Democrats abroad. So it's not to say that we don't meet with Republicans, but it is a challenge. So Republicans just aren't nearly as familiar with our issues. And as I mentioned about Congress being dysfunctional, even smaller bills are a big ask for Congress. So if renouncing isn't an option because you don't have a second citizenship, then what could be an option to get people out of the tax nightmare? Also, if RBT isn't an option, what could be a next best option? Like if we can't get RBT, what else can we get? And like, yeah, this point, sorry, I want to go back to this point about renouncing, which is we've done a very good job making a point to congressional staff that not everybody can renounce. That's not an option for everybody because not everybody is a dual citizen. So like, what are you supposed to do? Renounce and be stateless? No, nobody's going to do that. So how are we supposed to fix this tax nightmare for people? And then additionally, for those who most benefit from staying in the system, what fixes are needed. So, if we don't get RBT, if we don't get full RBT, what are the next best options? And what can we fix in the meantime to make things provide relief for people in the meantime? So this is where I wanted to introduce this concept called elective RBT. So essentially what and this is a proposal that's been in the works for about a year now. And essentially what it means is it's a policy that still needs work, and we need your help on that. We have had discussions and feedback from lots of different offices in DC, as well as other American abroad organizations, tax academics, and other stakeholders who would provide good feedback on the proposal. On a high level, essentially what it would do is it would be like renouncing, but you get to keep your US citizenship. So essentially there would be a procedure via the IRS that you would need to follow. I'm kind of thinking about it in terms of like it's a halfway between doing the streamlined filing procedure and doing and renouncing. There, you'd still have to file paperwork in order to receive this. And once you go through that procedure, you'd receive the equivalent of a CLN, which stands for a Certificate of Loss of Nationality, which is what you get when you renounce, that you can then use as the paperwork required to prove to your bank that you are no longer a US tax resident, which would make lots of different additional accounts available to you and savings products available to you in your country of residence. So essentially, if you were to return to the US, you would then become a tax resident again, obviously. And if you have US sourced income, you would still have to file a non-resident tax return, and you would still have to pay US tax under this proposal, because that makes sense. Like you should pay tax on US sourced income, like that makes sense. And also an exit tax would apply. So who will this help? It will help US citizens who are long-term residents living outside the US, people who are US citizens who don't plan on going back to the US in particular. It will help accidental Americans. It will help those unable to afford high tax preparation costs, so it will get you out of having to file every year so that you don't have to pay to prove that you don't owe any US tax. It will also get Americans abroad out of the FATCA, FBAR, PFIC, and foreign trust reporting nightmare. It will not help short-term Americans abroad or Americans abroad with a lot of US sourced income. This is really targeted for people who have most of their assets outside of the US. It will not help with the restrictions on investing. That is a whole other kettle of fish. You would need to basically weigh up if the exit, you having to pay the exit tax would outweigh staying in the system. And it also wouldn't help US citizens in countries with unique tax treaty benefits. So the bottom line here is that not everybody is going to benefit from this proposal. You will need to weigh up your personal circumstances to determine if you want to do it in the first place. So I just wanted to give some case studies here. And sorry, I know I'm running out of time, but I'll just do a few. So for example, Bob and Lisa are a couple with 2 children. Bob is employed by a Fortune 500 company, and he's sent to work in Toronto on a 3-year assignment. Bob and Lisa elect to continue to be taxed as US residents during that period. And then once they return back to the US, they'll obviously be US tax resident again then as well. So another example is a college student goes on a study abroad program in Mexico. She falls in love and decides to stay in Mexico with her partner, who she eventually marries. A few years later, she begins to put down roots in Mexico and realizes that it's difficult to continue filing US tax returns due to the cost to file, and that she doesn't owe any US tax. So she elects to pay the exit tax and transition to elective RBT. And then we have an accidental American example where Audrey was born in Australia and is an Australian father and and has an American mother. She's never lived in the US and has no US assets. And so as an accidental American, she would not owe an exit tax. So that just kind of gives you some illustrative examples. I have a few others here, but you're welcome to look at the slides for that. So what are the steps to passing this proposal? the first step is really getting all of the American abroad organizations on board with asking for this one thing, which is what has been done. And I just want to be really clear that this is not a Democrats abroad proposal. This is an American abroad proposal. This is something that we're working on across all of the American abroad organizations to get everybody on board and push for the same thing. What is going to be happening coming up is starting on April 1st until May 31st. So for about 60 days, this proposal is going to be made available online to the public, and we welcome your feedback. We want your input because we want to know what you think. Will you do it? Will you not do it? Do you think it's a good idea? What do you think? Like, we want your input. Like, we don't want to be pushing for something that you don't want, right? So like, we need your input. So this 2-month period, we're going to be asking for your feedback. So in about a month's time, we need your input on this, and we need you to ask others to give input on it as well, because the more input we have, the better we can make the proposal, and the easier it will be for us to go to Congress and say, this is what Americans abroad want, and actually get it done. From a kind of like introduction process, like we'd be looking at introducing into Congress later this year. And also, we're planning on doing our visit to Washington, D.C. in September. And we would look to socializing the bill. So basically telling congressional offices about it and trying to get them on board to support it. There is a must-pass tax bill for 2025. There are a number of tax provisions that expire in 2025 that have to be either extended or a new bill introduced and passed. So the strategy that most advocates use is, given that there are so few bills passing through Congress right now, what they do is they try to attach a smaller bill to a bigger bill in order to get it to pass, and that will be our strategy for this as well. What about for those who want to stay in the system, like for those people who wouldn't necessarily benefit, but they still have other tax problems? So we're focused on incremental relief, which is, for example, combining FATCA and FBAR, recognizing non-US pensions as pensions, recognizing non-US tax-free savings products, providing foreign tax credit relief for taxes paid on purchase of a sale of a non-US home, eliminating PFICs, and also double taxation on some of the most vulnerable individuals, like those who are receiving non-US benefits or disability payments. So we're still focused on that. We're still looking for other nooks and crannies where we can get incremental relief. The way I like to think of it is it's like moving a really heavy couch across the floor. Like, you pick one end up, you slide a rug underneath, you pick the other end up, you slide other piece of the rug underneath. And then once you get the rug finally underneath the couch, then you start pushing one end and then the other end until you finally get it to the other side of the room where you want the couch to be. So that's kind of the approach that we're taking, where it's baby steps. All of this is really small baby steps. But they're all steps in the right direction is the main thing. So what can you do to help? The main thing that you can do is you can join the Taxation Task Force mailing list. And this is the really key thing. Anytime we send an email from it's taxationtf@democratsabroad.org, that is always the email that is coming from the Taxation Task Force. You might get other emails from Democrats Abroad, but that's the email from the Taxation Task Force. When you get an email, you should flag it in your inbox, and anything we send you and ask of you to do, I ask that you participate in that action, because we do this, we run campaigns where, for example, we ran a campaign last year asking people to submit a comment to the State Department about reducing the renunciation fee. We've run campaigns asking people to contact those people that are appearing on their ballot, lots of different things that are very important in terms of engaging with members of Congress or soon to be members of Congress. And it's important to engage with them, especially before they're elected, because they're more open to listening to us because they want our vote, right? So if you get an email from us, participate in that action. We do not have enough people who are participating in our campaigns. And I'm saying this because not only because I'm frustrated, but because, like I mentioned before, we're just not getting the volume of people contacting their members of Congress or contacting candidates that are on their ballot for voting. And that's why they don't know about our issues. So the more of us that are contacting them and letting them know about these issues, the more we can get support and the faster we can pass legislation to provide relief. Also register and vote in your state's House and Senate if running primary races at votefromabroad.org. It's really super important that everybody votes. And I think this is really important because not only in terms of your vote matters, we have data that specifically indicates that it was the votes from abroad that helped Biden win in Georgia and Arizona in 2020. If it was not for those votes from abroad, then Biden would not have won. And so the DNC is paying attention to us. We are being paid attention to in certain circles. They know about us, but we need more people to vote. So the best place to register to vote is votefromabroad.org. You can also vote in the Democrats Abroad Global Presidential Primary. Also engage with House and Senate candidates before the election, and also volunteer for the Taxation Task Force. I'll just go through here really quickly because I'm conscious of time. The global presidential primary is next week. Voting by email has already started. You're casting your vote in the Democrats Abroad presidential primary means that it demonstrates how many of us exist as Democrats abroad to the DNC. So the more of us that vote in the global presidential primary, the more they see that we exist. It's one of the few times that ballots are cast specifically as Democrats abroad. So there are voting centers all over the world starting next week. You are welcome to go to an in-person voting center to vote, but you can also equally vote online. So you can do same-day registration in person or online by going to the link on the screen. I would really highly recommend and encourage that you participate in the Democrats Abroad Global Presidential Primary to help us demonstrate how many of us exist. Also, if you need help with registering to vote, we have lots of different voter assistance Zoom sessions. You can also email us on voterhelp@votefromabroad.org in order to help you register to vote. On a really basic level, not only does your voice matter, but like we use the data is available in terms of how many people cast their vote from abroad. And so when we go into congressional offices and we meet with members of Congress, we say to them, we looked at the data and we saw that X number of your constituents voted from abroad. So this is how many of your constituents are impacted by these tax issues. The more of us that vote from abroad, the bigger those numbers are that we can go into those congressional offices, and the sooner that we can get them to prioritize our issues when they know that there's a bigger number of people impacted by this. You can also help us with campaign outreach, which we're still working on, but we will be emailing on the mailing list about when we want you to reach out to House and Senate candidates that are going to be appearing on your ballot for November. So again, talking to members of Congress before they're elected in the lead up to an election is always a really great time to catch their attention. They're much more open and willing to engage in order to win your vote. And finally, volunteer for the Taxation Task Force. You don't have to be an expert. The main thing is you're passionate and you care. We need people from, in particular, lawyers or accountants or policy experts, but equally so, we need people who are good at communication or project management or logical thinkers, or even people that have connections to DC. That is always really super helpful too. We have lots of different roles that are available within the team as well. I'm always looking at expanding. We don't have enough people working on this. I am only one person and we need more help to make it happen sooner. So if you're interested, you can submit your volunteer application to join. So like this would be volunteering anywhere from 1 to however many hours you can put in a month. You know, it's up to you. We're all volunteers. We're all doing the best job that we can. And that's the best that we can do. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to enable the Q&A box so that you can submit your questions. So don't forget to upvote or like any of the questions that are submitted. And if you have, if you see any that you like, make sure you like it. So I'm going to be going through all the questions based in the order of which are most liked. So yeah, go ahead and take a look and submit your questions now. I'm just gonna, while you're submitting your questions, I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel, um, which is a federal advisory committee of the IRS. And basically, it's made up of a group of volunteers, at least one person from each state in the United States. And what they do is they submit recommendations to the IRS to improve customer service and communications with taxpayers. The IRS has to listen to the recommendations and suggestions put forward by the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel. There is one member of the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel who is an international member, and that is myself. So I am serving my last year out of a 3-year term as the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel member. And this coming year, there is actually going to be a new person. Applications are currently open. The deadline to apply is March 15th. So if you are interested, even this is a really great opportunity, especially if you're not a partisan kind of person, like you're not a Democrat. I know there's people that are probably Republicans on the call too. Hopefully, if you don't like partisan stuff, like you don't like party politics, this is a really great way of helping to fix the tax problems. It's not legislation, it's all through what can the IRS do on their own. You learn a lot. But you can read a blog post that I've written up on what it's like being the international member of the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel. And I'm also hosting 2 info sessions. I think it's really important that as many people apply as possible because this is a really incredibly important role for the American abroad community. Yeah, the next person is going to be awesome, but the more people that apply, the better pool of candidates that they have to pick from. It's not up to me, it's up to the Taxpayer Advocacy Panel. But I would really encourage you to consider applying if this is something that you are passionate about. And yes, seriously think about it. I had no idea I would get it. I applied really randomly and it worked out, and it's a really humbling position and you learn a lot, and it's very interesting work. So, and then these are some additional actions that you can take that I've outlined already. And also, I'm going to leave the feedback form up here while I do the Q&A. So, I'm just going to sort it by most liked here. So, okay, 2 questions. Why do banks in Europe need to know you have a US citizenship? Is it illegal not to tell them if dual citizenship? Of course. Okay, so I'll go with the it's 2 questions. I'll answer this first question. Why do banks in Europe need to know you have US citizenship? So to be honest, it's not just about US citizenship. It's a requirement from all of the banks in Europe to ask what your citizenship is in general. This has to do with general money laundering and tax evasion laws and rules that are being applied for everyone. In addition to, so FATCA is basically a tax reporting, it's a bank account reporting requirement from the banks as well as US citizens themselves to report non-US bank accounts. And the equivalent of FATCA is called the Common Reporting Standard, or CRS, which it's something like over 50 different countries participate. So it's a lot of different countries are exchanging data and information about who their customers are in order to help with preventing money laundering across the industry. So is it illegal not to tell them? I mean, it depends on your country of residence, I think. I think what is more important for you to ask yourself is why wouldn't you report it? you do need to keep in mind that if you're not truthful when you open an account, or if the bank asks you for updated information about yourself and they find out, then they have a right to close your account. So you need to keep that in mind in your decision making. And then the second question, and do you think the elective RBT proposal will pass? And if so, what is the timeline? I don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict the future. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's very difficult. But it's not impossible. A lot of the things that we're doing, I've had lots of people say, oh, you'll never do that. And we've done it. So you need to keep in mind that the more people that get involved, the easier it will be to help us get RBT passed, or this proposal passed. So the next, I'm just going to read some of the other smaller questions. Would it be possible to have a sample letter which we could send to Congress and share with others? We are not asking you to we're not asking you to contact Congress at this moment in time. What I'm asking you to do is to submit your feedback on the proposal in April and May. Once we have a bill introduced, then we will ask you to write to your members of Congress to ask them to support the bill. And this is why it's so important to sign up for the mailing list so that you know what actions to take and when, because that's really important. Yes, I can send you a sample letter of what to say to your member of Congress today, and you can do that. That would be great. But what is additionally helpful is for you to write to them when we ask you to as well. Okay, next question is, what is the exit tax going to cost? It will depend on your personal circumstances, and there will be more information made available during the open comment period in April and May. I do not know for your personal circumstances. It will depend on where your money is and who you are and your personal circumstances. So again, you may want to do elective RBT, but you may not. It really does come down to your personal circumstances. Next question, shouldn't we have a general online petition that can be accessed by all Americans abroad, sort of like a signature campaign? So we don't do petitions. Petitions generally tend to be a, sorry, this is kind of giving you a little more insight here. My role as chair of the taxation task force is to do effective things that will actually make a difference. My view on petitions, my personal view on petitions, is that they are not an effective advocacy tool. They are an effective mailing list building exercise for organizations to build their mailing list. But in terms of a petition being handed in with lots of signatures to ask for a certain thing, I have found that a personal letter to your member of Congress explaining the tax problems that you have experienced to be a lot more effective in some cases compared to a petition, even with thousands of signatures. But that's my personal view. That's how I have taken my perspective on advocacy. Others who are working on advocacy may take a different view, but that's just my view. I'm conscious that we're at time. So I am happy to take more questions in the Q&A, but you will get the recording. I think we'll just go for another 5-10 minutes because I just note there are a number of questions. So next question is there an example email available to personalize for local reps and Senate use? Yes. We have information available on our website on how to write to your members of Congress. So we can send you that in the follow-up materials. How are Social Security from US and pensions from the US impacted by what you are suggesting? It really depends on what country you live in and also what the tax treaty has for the country that you live in as well. Like I said before, it will depend on your personal circumstances on whether or not doing elective RBT is something that you will want to do. One issue that no one seems to address is that the US doesn't seem to want Americans abroad to hold money anywhere. In other words, we have to file FATCA and FBAR for all foreign accounts, but they make it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to hold an account in the US, while still assuming we have an account in the US to use for our tax issues. Is anyone addressing this anomaly? Yes, I totally agree. We have been talking to both some congressional offices as well as some of the US banking organizations about this issue. To be honest, it's a different law that or different laws and regulations in terms of banking access in the US versus banking access outside of the US. And this is the incompatibility issue that we're facing. So it's not the same people working on these issues. And there are actually a range of bank accounts that US bank accounts that will accept Americans abroad as customers with a non-US phone number and a non-US address. So I see somebody has just mentioned the State Department Federal Credit Union. There's also PenFed. There's also the there's the Navy Credit Union. There's the UN Credit Union. So there are a number of credit unions in particular that will accept Americans abroad as customers. I'm working on a blog article at the moment that would make a list of those. So keep your eyes peeled for that and sign up for the mailing list to receive that. What is an exit tax and how much would it likely be? Again, an exit tax is you would be taxed on your assets as a one-time tax in order to get out of the system. How much it would be would depend on your personal circumstances. I received a ballot for the global presidential primary and a ballot from New York. I called New York about if this is double voting and they said no, and the ballot from Democrats abroad is only a survey, and that what counts is the one from New York. Is this true? So you can only vote in one presidential primary. So if you got your ballot from New York, sorry, let me take a step back. If you want to vote in the Democrats Abroad Global Presidential Primary, you will vote on the ballot for Democrats Abroad. There's two candidates. There's Biden and Marianne Williamson. So there's only two candidates on our ballot. You can vote for whoever you like, and then you cast that ballot. On your New York primary ballot, you will leave the presidential primary options blank. You cannot vote in both. That is double voting. Most likely, whoever you spoke to in New York isn't aware of Democrats Abroad or how it operates or works, but you can only vote in one presidential primary in the world. So either the Democrats Abroad one or your states. You can't vote in both. But what you can do is you leave your New York presidential ballot section blank, and then you can vote in all of the other primary races on that ballot and send it back to New York. So that's how it would work. If I vote in the state, will I incur state tax? That is going to be a webinar I'm going to host on April 15th. I have not set up the event yet. However, I would really recommend that you join the Taxation Task Force mailing list in order to be notified when that event is made available and you can RSVP for it. Does DA have a track record of getting any tax legislation passed that positively affected Americans abroad? What makes this round different? So no, Democrats abroad does not have a record of getting any tax legislation passed. And no American abroad organization has had any tax legislation passed. Although, sorry, I'll correct that because it was in the 70s that Democrats abroad, when Democrats abroad first started, we were advocating for legislation to be passed so that the right to vote was protected, and also for the right to vote in federal elections was not impacted by taxes. So in the 70s, yes, there was legislation that was passed that protected the right to vote from abroad in federal elections, as well as making sure that there wasn't any impact in terms of tax. So taxes are not connected with voting in federal elections. voting can be used as a piece of criteria for state tax, but it can't be the sole reason for establishing state tax liability. And I'll go into a lot more of that on the April 15th webinar. But to go back to the question, not in recent history, what makes this round different? I mean, the momentum that we have been able to gather and the feedback that we have been putting in, we have been getting from congressional offices, as well as the amount of work that we have been putting into familiarizing our issues with congressional offices has been very different. And it takes time. I know people are very impatient, but it does take time, especially with how things move so slowly in Congress, in order to build those relationships, in order to build credibility on the Hill in Washington, D.C. So that is the difference. I'm not gonna promise that we're going to pass this bill next year. But what I am saying is that we are going to make our best effort. And that is the best that we can do. I mean, you look at other issues like there hasn't been any gun reform legislation passed. There hasn't been any there hasn't even been a bill passed on reforming student loans, for example. A lot of that reform has been coming from President Biden because he hasn't been able to get anywhere with Congress. There hasn't been any bills passed for the Equal Rights Amendment. This is no different from any other bigger issues. The only difference is that we're smaller, we have less of a presence, we don't actually live in Washington, D.C. We have a lot of things against us, but at the same time, we have a lot of positives, which is that this is super non-controversial on a lot of different levels. Both Democrats and Republicans get it, it's just that getting through those, those barriers and breaking down those stereotypes and getting people to a yes. This is not easy work, but we are doing our best on it, and we need more people. That's the bottom line. More people need to get involved to make it happen sooner. I'll take two more questions and then we're gonna wrap up. Would opt-in RBT make you ineligible for Social Security income? No. No, it would not. If you paid in to Social Security, then you get it. Even if you renounce, you still get your Social Security based on what you paid into. And there are lots of people who are not US citizens who get Social Security as well. So it wouldn't have an impact on that. Okay, last question. Does the tax treaty between the US and other countries address RBT? No. The answer is no. Okay, great. I think that is it. I'm sorry, guys, that we haven't been able to get to all of the questions, but I hope that was helpful. Thank you. Please be sure to fill in the feedback form, and yeah, we will send out the recording and the slides as soon as we can. Thank you for your feedback. Thank you for attending. I really appreciate your input. Do keep an eye out for when the open comment period on this proposal comes out on April 1st. So thank you again, everybody, for attending. I hope you all have a good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are in the world.